So without further ado, let's get started here. Our first story today is a departure from our original delivery method, but I think you're going to enjoy it. Generally, we have people telling stories in the first person, or it's a family member or a story they're very familiar with. Today's story is going to be told by Jan Lindstrom, who's a very close friend of the person who owns this story. Jan's here today to tell the story of her dear friend Tom Corsi and Leonard Showalter's ill-fated flight from Dryden to Kenora in 1966. Jan will tell Tom's story in his words, and then we're going to hear from Don McInnes, who was a member of the party who happened upon the incident, and he will tell us his and Ron Symbolisti's, who couldn't be with us today. He's going to tell that version of the story. So it's a story told from two different directions. So without ado, let's welcome Jan Lindstrom and Mac McInnes to the stage.
Good morning. A couple of years ago, I was visiting old Dryden friends, Tom and Betty Corsi, in their home in Nanaimo, BC. The conversation had turned to his survival of a plane crash many years before. And being my usual self when it comes to my belief that people's stories should be told, I said he should write the story down, which he did. And then, of course, I said it should be told. I found two of Tom's rescuers, persuaded them to write their remembrances, and am extremely pleased that Mac McInnes is here today to tell his and Ron Symbolisti's side of the tale. So here is Tom's story. 50-year survivor. This story begins in Dryden, Ontario, February 26, 1966. My wife Betty and I had moved to Dryden from Kenora only 2 months earlier. I had completed my heavy-duty mechanics apprenticeship and got hired by the Dryden Paper Company. I was 24 years old, and we had two sons, Tom, 4 years old, and Terry, only 2 weeks old. My wife's parents, Elma and Leonard Showalter, lived in a logging camp some 100 miles northwest of Dryden. He was only 48 years of age. They were visiting us and owned a small Aeronca Champ airplane, a two-seater, one front and one in the rear. The plan for Len and I was to fly to Kenora as he had business with a Mr. Lindstrom who owned Kenora Fish Market. We were to return to Dryden before dusk. This same day, a surprise baby shower was to be held for my wife at a friend's home. On Saturday morning, we had pancakes and sausages for breakfast, and my mother-in-law, Elma, casually said, "These pancakes are heavy. I hope it doesn't force the plane down." A statement that has been with me ever since. We got to the government dock where Len's plane was located at 9 a.m. It was difficult to get started due to cold weather and flooding, but we got into the air shortly after and headed west toward Kenora. The plane was on skis, and all the lakes were snow-covered. Temperature was 15 degrees Fahrenheit. The engine sputtered a few times as we flew west. We dropped down on Tago Lake to have a pee and check the plane over. Taking off again was fine. Shortly after, Len spotted a wolf on the ice, and as he banked the plane, it sputtered and started to spiral downward. I came to and could hear the gyro still spinning, so I had only been knocked out for minutes. My first thought was to get out of the plane in case of fire. My torso was hanging out the door. I had to pull myself back into the plane and try to get my legs freed as they were pinned under the front seat. I finally got to a position and fell right out of the door into the snow. I looked up at Len and his body was shaking, and I thought he was just knocked out and was coming to. I tried to get up so I could pull him out of the plane, and I then realized that he had died. My left foot felt like mush, and both bones in my right leg were broken mid-calf. Ribs either broken or cracked, and it was hard to breathe. My right arm was useless as it was broken right at the elbow. A hunk of aluminum from the door had also gone into my arm. My spine was terribly sore. I later found it was 3 crushed vertebrae. I also had blood coming from my mouth. My right eyebrow was split open and blood covered my face and jacket. My face was so swollen I could easily see it from my left eye. I remember thinking that I felt like a giant hand had just thrown me full force against a rock wall. Sometime over the early part of the day, a small plane, maybe a 180, went right over top of our location, and all I could do was watch it disappear in the distance. I found a map of the area. Oh, I'm falling a little behind here. Oh, I meant to have that up a bit ago. That's the plane crash. Okay. There. I found a map of the area just to get a feel of our location. I could hear a tractor working somewhere within a 10-mile radius, which would have been Mando Camp 314. I'd been using the shotgun as a crutch from the time I got out of the plane. I did not realize that the barrel was packed with snow and ice and shot once into the air. This resulted in the barrel being blown and would be questionable whether it would have worked a second time. It was also a difficult task with only one arm to use. I thought I would keep the ammunition in case of wolves. I tried to make a splint for my leg out of slats from the aircraft's frame. I located a hunk of rope from inside of the plane. I soon gave up on this, as the aluminum salvage from the door would have cut my leg off, and the rest would have been impossible. I also thought that if blood started to come out of my boot, I would have to make a tourniquet. At this time, I tried to write my wife a goodbye note. All I had to use was the blood from my forehead. I later wiped it off with snow, and as it wasn't readable anyway. And I remember saying to myself, if there's a God, I need his help now. There was an axe, a tarp, and a 1-gallon can of gas in the plane. I pulled the tarp out and tried to roll myself into it for warmth, doing this several times over the day. I soon found myself drifting away and the pain easing, so had to try and do something before I went to sleep permanently. Now, by using the shotgun as a crutch, I could pull myself around enough to see the lay of the land and what possibilities there were to get down onto the ice. My idea was to try to light a fire down on the lake when or if another plane flew over. I knew that this would take some time, as both bones were broken in my right leg, plus all of my other injuries. Trying to get down the slope was going to be very slow and painful. I couldn't set the plane on fire as Len's body was in it, and I couldn't move him. It was probably early afternoon when I started the slow trek toward the lake, which was approximately 300 feet away. The snow was 2 to 3 feet deep. I decided to take the gas can and seat cushions, as they could be fuel for a signal fire. I had to also take the tarp for warmth. As I pulled myself along with the shotgun as a crutch, I would shake snow off some boughs and wood and put them along my path for a fire later. I moved the cushions, can, and tarp bit by bit, which was very slow. It took, I think, about 2 or 3 hours to go 50 feet, and it was quite obvious that I wasn't going to make it to the lake. I soaked the cushions in gas and poked them into a group of evergreen trees. I lit them and they burst into flame that lasted about 5 minutes until the gas was burned off. This was total devastation for me. I just stood there depressed and thinking that all that is left is to get back to the plane and make a shelter underneath to die in. I don't know how long I just stood there after the short fire. It must have been close to 4 p.m. as the sky was darkening when I saw someone moving through the trees, not 50 feet from where I was standing. My first reaction was that I was starting to crack up and hallucinate. It took a few minutes for me to shout, "Help!" He turned and said, "What's the matter?" I said, "Plane crash." He hollered to his friends, and they were on me in seconds. I guess at that moment I just collapsed. My first request was to ask if they would go and check on my father-in-law, Len. They came back right away and confirmed that he had passed. They had orange juice, and I had my first drink of the day. I'd been eating snow, which I later learned was not good. My thoughts during the day were very mixed. With Len being only 48 years old and me at 24, I thought if I could only live to be 48, I would be happy. These 4 high school students were on an ice fishing expedition. Ron Simbalisti, Larry Powers, Mac McInnes, and Frank McKay. 2 of the boys left for help on their snowshoes to hike 5 miles to a logging camp. The other 2 stayed and got a fire going very quickly and looked after me. Even now, I cannot remember all that took place after I saw the vision of these 4 young men. It was some time before men arrived on a snow machine pulling a sleigh. I recall them discussing my condition and not wanting to move me, not knowing all of my injuries. I remember telling them that my only injury was a broken leg so that they would move me. They bundled the tarp around me and tied me to the sleigh. It was quite a rough ride for me as there were large drifts on the ice. The men stopped many times to check on me. We covered some land also, and this caused the machine to work harder and burn a belt off. They got this fixed, and we got to the cabin belonging to some American fishermen. They tipped the sleigh sideways to get me through the door, and I remember feeling the warmth. I do not know how long it was before the ambulance arrived. There were 2 male attendants on the ambulance out of Kenora. I remember seeing Godfrey Neal. Then I was tilted again to get into the back of the ambulance. They covered me and put heat bombs around my torso. I was still so cold, I just remember shaking. At the hospital, I was checked over by Dr. Bringleson and staff. A cast was quickly put on the leg that had both bones broken. Both arms were set high on pillows. I guess they just let me go to sleep. When my wife got there, she said my face was very swollen, all black and tripled in size. The eyebrow was cut end to end, and I could hardly be recognized. Now at this point, here are a few thoughts from Tom's wife, Betty. On the evening of February 26th, a surprise baby shower was held for me at the home of a family friend. The party ended around 9 or 10 p.m. with a phone call from Tom's brother, Bob, who was the OPP officer for Dryden. His wife, Donna, who was also at the party, took the call, and that's how we found out that my father's plane had crashed. It was also stated that only one of the men had been taken from the crash site. What followed was a big blur as our 2-week-old boy had to be taken to Auntie Donna's, and Bob would drive me, my mom, and our 4-year-old son, Tom, to Kenora. Tom held my hand all the way. Now back to Tom's writing. After a few days of convalescing, the staff told me that they had taken x-rays of every part of my body. The right elbow wasn't cast until then. 3 crushed vertebrae, cracked ribs, the bones in my left foot were broken. After 10 days, I was into surgery to have a 7-inch plate screwed onto the large bone of my right leg. My stay was 57 days, and long before that, I was telling doctors that I was fine and should be going home. Soon after, a doctor told me to get up and go if I thought I could. I got propped up with the help of a nurse, and everything started spinning. and the doctor said that I'd better get it into my mind that it would be a long time before I could go home, and up to a year before I could go back to work. From that day on, I realized and accepted the fact that it was still going to be a long haul. My release day was best. I finally could get back to Dryden and be with my family. For the duration of my hospitalization, my wife and sons stayed in Kenora with Judy and Joe Taves, our longtime friends. Their compassion and caring has stayed with us to this day. It's hard to believe that these 4 boys were way out in this remote area snowshoeing and ice fishing, so near where the plane crashed, and to realize I have had another 50 years and more to enjoy. So thanks again to Frank McKay, Larry Powers, Ron Cimbalisti, and Mac McInnes. Those are some of the newspaper headlines of the month or so. Before I call Mac out, I believe that with John Paul Jones is Heather Jones. Is she here? Yes, she's down here. She is young Tom Corsi's partner and old Tom Corsi's daughter-in-law. They live in Victoria, and she is from here, 6 degrees of separation. So nice to have you here. So now here's a slightly older Mac McInnes with his and Ron's remembrances.
Good morning. I remember a bright, very cold morning that was to be my first introduction into the sport of ice fishing. It started out with good friends Ron, Frank, Larry, and myself, packed into a nice warm heated vehicle that seemed to be driven awfully deep into the wilderness. When finally arriving at the road's endpoint, we then snowshoed/stumbled, that was me, further into a lake that Ron and Frank said was one we wanted, a small unnamed lake north of Porcus Lake. Equipment was broken out, and I spent my time trying to light a fire and to stop shivering. You know, I can't even remember if we as a group caught anything. I do remember, however, during sometime in the afternoon hours, that there was a momentary pause from all of us as we heard a sound that was not natural to sounds you would hear in a frozen, snow-covered wilderness area. I remember Larry saying, "Did you hear that?" But I don't remember anyone saying anything about it sounded like a plane. After a period of checking lines and idle banter, we started packing up as dark comes early in the winter here. Heading back, it was a given that we would just follow our tracks back to the vehicle and then back to town. In an instant, life can change from the ordinary to the dramatic and sad. My recollection is that Ron or Larry were the first to see the plane to our right. There was a moment of stunned silence, then one of us noticed some kind of movement, and then it was a rush as we all headed to the plane. At about 10 feet from the plane and Tom, I distinctly remember him calling as I approached, "Hey, McInnes," which was surprising that I didn't recognize him at first. I kind of remember all of us gathering around at the front of the plane and coming to an agreement that the pilot had passed. So our attention turned to Tom, and it soon became apparent that Tom's responses were becoming less logical, shock setting in, I guess. And now here's some of what Ron has written. We quickly decided that Frank, who knew the area better than any of us, and Mac would walk out for help while Larry and I would stay with Tom to get a fire going to try to make him as comfortable as possible. We could see that Tom was pretty badly injured, and while none of us knew a lot of first aid, we knew that he should not be moved and be kept as warm as possible. I gave Tom my old green parka to wear, and Larry and I gathered as much wood as possible before it got too dark, as we knew it would be a long time before help arrived. Larry and I didn't know that Frank and Mac had decided to walk to the Mando camp rather than to the car. And now back to my recollections. All I remember of this trek back was being exhausted and slowing Frank down, as jogging on snowshoes will result in a lot of face plants. That's me again. And it seemed to be that he was always waiting for me to catch up. When at last we got to the Mando camp, there were some other vehicles there, Americans I seem to recall, who had come up to ice fish. Upon hearing our story, Frank was driven to the nearest place where they could find a phone and make the call. Now, I remember only that there was a flurry of activity when police arrived with snow machines towing sleds. I was pretty much just an observer at this point, but to my everlasting regret, I found myself on a sled. Why regretful? It is now very late evening, and the temperature has fallen into the -35 area, with a wind chill boosted by the snow machines, and I'm not dressed for snowmobiling. I have never ice fished or snowmobiled since, nor do I have any desire to do so ever again. Enough said. I was surprised to see how much stuff Ron and Larry had pulled out of the plane to keep a fire going, which kept Tom and themselves as warm as possible. I helped where I could, as Len Showalter, the pilot, was removed from the plane and preparations were made for the trip back. So at this point, I had witnessed a tragic incident, a pilot killed, and a truly unbelievable set of circumstances, beginning with a man surviving a plane crash, and that crash occurring in the remotest and coldest area of northwestern Ontario. Also, this crash site occurred beside a one-time ice fishing trail created by 4 people only a short time earlier. To have all of these circumstances coming together and resulting in Tom's survival is truly amazing. Godspeed, Tom, the same as you had that day. And again, here's from Ron, who did a short summary. As for the 4 of us, who were in our late teens at the time of the accident, we are now approaching or past 70 years of age. Larry went on to become a dentist, and at the last time I heard was living in southern Ontario. Mac has recently returned to Kenora after living 40 years in Toronto as a central office manager and provisioning engineer for Bell Canada. I went on to become an engineer and have lived in Yellowknife for 27 years. Frank, the real leader of the February 1966 fishing expedition, went on to become a machinist with the CPR in Winnipeg, but unfortunately died from leukemia 4 years ago at the age of 65. I wrote a small postscript to Tom, and I hope you enjoy this. In summary, I just have to mention something concerning this incident that proves the saying that what goes around comes around. Consider for a moment that earlier in the year, before this plane crash, I was in a judicial courtroom trying to beat a traffic vehicle charge, brackets teenager/muscle car. Read that into what you like. Short story long, I lost. Not only did I lose, but I had to endure a severe tongue lashing from the judge, who called me a reckless young man with hooligan tendencies and destined to be a detriment to society if I didn't correct my ways. Well, here I am now, 2 or 3 weeks after the crash and rescue, and at a small recognition event where they had the same judge expounding on what fine young men of the community we were. So, Tom, one of the reactions to this tragic incident for me is that here is where I see and feel that you, in a way, saved my life by making me, in just a short turnaround, into a solid, fine, upstanding model and symbol of good citizenship. One shudders to think of what I might have become. God bless, and thank you.